Hello! In today's video I want to show you how to easily line things up together, how to be precise with a float trick, and how to not waste all of the brain juice when rotational placement is getting involved. To understand fully what are we going to talk about in this video, you better check out the Tiny Dragon's float method video first, as well as my previous videos about using one anchor and rotational placement with a float trick combo. The trick itself was discovered by a Tiny Dragon and was polished with a sprinkle of my help. In a short words, the float trick is mostly about cancellation mechanic. That is when instead of placing something with the left click, you place it with a number key from your hotbar. The key should contain any placeable item. Then you have to place something on top of the anchor that we temporarily moved, and to finish up the trick we have to trigger it. We can do it either by changing plots or picking up and placing the anchor. To achieve a specific height and distance, you have to prepare the starting point and the final point. As an anchor for the items that can be placed on top of other things, we can use any items from Stackable category. Here's the full list of them made by a Tiny Dragon. For items that can be placed only on the floor or on the ground, there is just one item we can use. It's the Winterlights Red Present. It was obtainable during the winter event, and unfortunately there are no alternative for this item at the moment. As our first example in here, I will be creating a toothbrushes. Since the items like knives and cups that I'm going to use to imitate toothbrushes can be placed on top of other items, means in that case we can use any stackable items as an anchor. The hardest part usually is to connect our first item to an anchor. That's why I always suggest to search for the easiest item to link our anchor to. The best option is to pick the item that does not require a use of rotational placement. In this example, it will be a cup. Keep in mind that the anchor will be permanently linked to a floating item unless you choose to get rid of floated trick and break the link. That means that the starting point for this first float trick is supposed to be where you want your anchor to be permanently. It's better to pick the starting point for the first item that we're gonna float close to the final point of the trick. That way it will be easier for us to work with it and to line things up without much of an effort. I'm gonna show you how to work in the situations when the anchor is far away from a floating object in my next examples. In order to float this cup so it fully stands on the sink, we would have to compensate the height of our anchor, Magi Market Basket in my case. For that, we need to add extra piece of the same anchor to our starting point, so we can gain more height so it would sink more. If you are same OCD as I am, then you'd notice that there is a slight gap between the cup and the sink. To get rid of that, I will add one more item to my starting point to gain slightly more height. I will be using a dessert plate. Now we do the float trick, placing with number key, put the cup on top and trigger the trick the way you want. Moving the starting point away it works too. To create the toothbrushes, we will have to move our anchor to a shelf. Stack some things on top of each other, I'm gonna call it a pillar of things. Then place the extra piece of the same anchor on top of this pillar. I will refer to it as a fake anchor. The most important part of this method is to remember the exact spot on the pillar of things where you place the fake anchor. Then we place the item we want to float on the top of our fake anchor. If you don't want to take an extra step, then you have to remember the exact place where you placed this item in relation to the anchor. But it's okay if you're not, because we will be able to double check its position later. Now it's time to line things up. For that, we will be moving the shelf and the pillar of things towards each other. After we pick the right rotation of the shelf, we just try to catch the knife with the cup. Once we're satisfied with the lining up, we remove our fake anchor and place it somewhere else. Then we grab the real anchor, drag it to the exact same spot on the pillar of things where we had our fake anchor before, and place it with the float trick by pressing the number key instead of the left click. Now, if you remember the exact spot where the item were on the fake anchor, then you just place it with the left click where it should be. If you do not, go check the fake anchor and see at what exact place we have to put our item at. Now, with left click, place it on top of the real anchor at the right spot. If you trigger the float trick with a change of plots, items will jump back, and it could be useful in some cases. In my case, I will change the rotation, so I will trigger it by picking up the shelf and placing it again. To make a second one toothbrush, I'm gonna take it by the anchor and aim to its final place where it should be, to double check with what rotation I have to place my knife on the Maji Market basket. I'm gonna speed up the video of me doing the same exact process that I did for the first toothbrush. So after we prepared our fake anchor, we just have to repeat the same process of lining up and changing the fake anchor with the real one, using the float trick and placing the knife on top. In the next example, I will be creating both. I will cover a situation when we will be lining up the floating item that is far away from an anchor, as well as I'm gonna share a nuance about sinking items, maximum depth, and a walkaround for that. Since we don't have in this concept any items without a need for rotational placement that we could have easily connect to an anchor, we will have to perform the rotational placement for the first item. But when it's about 90 degrees, it's still quite easy to wrap the head around it. To find the axis that is responsible for finding the right height, we would have to see where the top and bottom of our anchor is facing. If we want to float our item higher, then it will be towards the direction the top of the anchor is facing. If we want to sink item deeper, we would have to go the opposite way, where the bottom of the anchor is facing. Once we pick the desired height, now it's time to get the distance, but this feels quite intuitive. I'm leaving the marker first, and then I grab the anchor, drag it to a marker and place it with the float method. Then I remove the marker away, double check how the item will flip with the way we rotated our shelf, and then just place it with the left click on top of the anchor. Then just activate the trick. Now about the depth rules. If you sank the item too deep, it will get reset and spawn in your lamp zone. So usually when you're trying to sink item, it's better to make sure that the item sticks to an anchor and won't reset. For that, we would have to reload the plot by leaving it and getting back. Here's the lamp zone that I'm talking about. If your item got reset, then you have to float it again and lift it up slightly higher. For that, you could do the same lining up method that I showed before with the toothbrushes example. Same method that I'm doing right now in here, but in my case, I'm trying to add more distance between my anchor and the boat. But to place the item higher, in relation to my character, you would need to place it closer to lift it up the item higher. To line up the second half of the boat, we do the same way as I showed before with the toothbrushes. But the only change now would be that we have our anchor far away from the floating item, and we need to do an extra step to cut the distance between an anchor and a floating object to make things easier to line up. For that, I'm going to take any stackable item. I'm going to refer to it as an anchor extension. First, place it with the left click close to the floated item. Then pick it up, drag it close to an anchor to subtract the distance in between, place it with float method, and then place our real anchor on top of that extension. Trigger the trick by picking up and placing the extension. And then we just do the lining up method. Rotate the shelf, make a pillar of things with a fake anchor on top, memorize the exact spots of the fake anchor and the item, line it up, and then we have to replace the fake anchor with the real one, place it with the float method, and then trigger the trick. But there is an important thing. Since we used an anchor extension, we have to do one more step after we line things up. We need to find our real anchor and place it with the float method on top of pillar of things. For that, grab our extension, rotate it to find where our real anchor at, then place it somewhere with a number key, not the left click, and then grab the real anchor, drag it to the pillar of things, and place it with the float method. Finish up the trick with placing the item on top and activating it. Last but not least, the walk around about the sinking depth. In case if you want your items to sink deeper than the maximum depth before the reset, you can use an extra anchor that will sink the anchor that is connected to all of the floating items that we have, and that way we will be able to sink items deeper than the maximum depth. So with information that I shared in this tutorial, you should be able to create build like this one. Technically, you can build the whole house on one anchor. The float method is very flexible, and even though it might seem difficult to master, I definitely can say that it's worth it. I guess I shared everything I wanted in relation to this lining up method for the float trick, and I hope the tutorial was helpful. If you want to see the chapters in our videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Also, if you want to learn more about this or the other tricks, I recommend to join a Tiny Dragons Discord server. The link will be in the description. And if you have any housing related questions about the tricks or need any help with it, you can find us there and we would be glad to help. Till next time, bye!